Before continuing with the next edition of Geopolitics and Empire, I would like to announce that this is the first podcast I am doing after TNT Radio. The Ides of March was my last broadcast on TNT Radio. For the last 2 years, I have been doing a daily live TNT broadcast, interviewing between 10 and 15 guests a week, which was grueling, and I did it pretty much nonstop for the last 2 years. I'm burned out, frankly, and need to slow things down. Croatian, Mexican style. TNT Radio has been absolutely fantastic. No censorship. They paid me a salary I was very content with. I've been able to lean on my TNT Radio salary in order to survive, but had been putting Geopolitics and Empire on the back burner. I plan now to refocus my efforts on the Geopolitics and Empire guerrilla transmission and put out much more content. So I ask listeners to please support me if you love Geopolitics and Empire and get value out of it. The best way to do that would be to become a paid subscriber on the Geopolitics and Empire Substack for either $5 a month or $50 a year. You can also buy me a coffee or donate via DonorBox. Geopolitics and Empire can only survive and thrive with your support. Otherwise, I'll be perfectly happy to retreat into obscurity to some Mexican pueblo or seaside town and sell tacos. That is not a joke. Thank you. And now, Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Jeffrey E. Paul, who's a research professor in the Social Philosophy Center of the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University, professor emeritus at Bowling Green State University, where he played a pivotal role in the original founding of the Social Philosophy and Policy Center and was its associate director. He's also an executive editor of the journal Social Philosophy and Policy, published by Cambridge University Press, which has the largest circulation of any philosophy journal in the U.S., Great Britain, or Canada. He's been a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He's published many essays in major philosophy journals and edited many philosophical collections. And we're here to discuss his latest book, Winning America's Second Civil War: Progressivism's Authoritarian Threat, Where It Came From, How to Defeat It, from Encounter Books, who I'm a fan of as well. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. I look forward to this.
Yes, and maybe to start, and the theme of your book, I just finished reading it. I very much enjoyed it. I urge listeners to pick up a copy. And I think about this theme a lot myself as a U.S. citizen. I worry about where we're at, this second civil war, this authoritarian threat. What moved you sort of to write this book? And if you want to just tell us the basic thesis before we dig in.
Yeah, what moved me to write the book was not only my early experience in the academy, both as an undergraduate and a graduate student, where it was impossible not to realize that the academy was politically skewed in one direction, and dramatically so. And then books began to be published about this, originally in the 50s, but then an extremely important book was published in the early 70s called The Divided Academy, in which a huge survey was done of 60,000 faculty members. And what it revealed was that the academy at that time, including all disciplines, business, engineering, medicine, all the disciplines, were about 2/3 what one would call left of center and maybe 1/3 right of center. Over the years, there have been lots of subsequent surveys, and they showed an accelerating rate of this discord, political discord, continuing. So that today, in most places, 70-80% of the faculty is going to be left of center, probably 20% in the middle, and less than 10% on what's called the right today. But the schism is even more pronounced, much more pronounced, if you look only at the social sciences and the humanities. So if you look at a history department, for example, the typical history department, if it has 25 or 30 people, it might have 2 or 3 at most who would be right of center. Many have none. And that would be the same for philosophy, for political science, for sociology. Economics is the one that has the most, what we call conservatives, and they, about maybe 1/3 of them are right of center, and there are a few in the middle, and then, probably at least 50% are going to be left of center. Now, so the question is, presented itself to me, is how did this happen? Was it always this way? Was it not this way, but it just suddenly became this way? We know that it was only noticed for the first time publicly in 1950, when William F. Buckley, the founder of National Review, had just graduated from Yale and wrote the book God, Man at Yale, in which he focused on basically religious studies there, but focused as well on the economics department. What struck him about the economics department was the whole thing was left wing, and there was no variation in their views. There was no political variety, and he expected the opposite when he went to Yale. He was shocked, but he didn't investigate why. I talked to and became friends with the author of one of the surveys, a very famous political scientist, Seymour Martin Lipset, and who was at Harvard and then at Stanford. And I met him at Stanford. And he told me, he said, the indirect evidence suggests this goes back much further to about 1900. And I was shocked, but I didn't ask him, how did that come to be? Was it always this way or what? So I had to investigate for myself. And what I found was the following. The founding of the United States was a singularity in human history in the following sense. It adopted principles that were only recently identified and argued for by a British philosopher, John Locke, in a book called The Second Treatise of Civil Government, which came out in 1690. The opinions expressed in that book just tore through American culture. Most became Lockeans, which meant that they believed all members of the human species had a right of self-ownership. Now, in human history, this was unprecedented. There was always some sort of tyrant, sovereign, emperor, etc., who had privileges of self-ownership, which the others did not enjoy, but enjoyed only whatever he allowed them to have. This was unique. And it said that people can voluntarily join governments or not. They can form governments or not, but for only one legitimate reason: to protect those individual rights. One can elect not to be a member of a nation and then defend their own rights, but a nation is only legitimate if it is singularly devoted to the protection of those rights. That's what the United States was founded on. They were founded on that in spite of the fact that all the states permitted slavery at the outset. The northern states began to discard that during the Revolutionary War, one by one. And then they were confronted by the fact that southern states did not. And then that meant, because of the passionate belief in these rights, that a civil war was inevitable, since they debated this question relentlessly from 1820, I would say, till 1861, when the war broke out after the Republican Party was elected, and Lincoln became president of the United States. The war succeeded. I think about 600,000 Americans were killed in that war, a war to defend the right of self-ownership. Ultimately, that was what the war was about, and to protect those, make sure those rights were protected after the war was over. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed. Now, there's a great irony. They fought this war at great cost of human life, and were passionate about it and knew exactly why they were fighting the war. In fact, the leading philosopher of the first half of the 19th century, academic philosopher, first half of the 19th century, was a passionate, he was president of Brown University, and he was a passionate defender of natural rights. So the war ends in 1865. In 1875-76, the ideological situation in the United States was in the process of being completely reversed. And here's how it happened. The universities wanted to have doctoral programs in the United States. They did not have doctoral programs. There was one European country that had doctoral programs, and it had them for 200 years. And their institutions were research institutions, in addition to being pedagogical institutions, teaching institutions. And those were the German universities. And so what they decided to do, the university presidents, was to start doctoral programs, but to start them with only people holding legitimate doctorates, meaning Americans who were trained, educated, and received doctorates at German universities. And that's how the first doctorate programs were formed. Now, in the natural sciences, this was an enormous success, bringing in German physicists, American trained by Germans, physicists, mathematicians, biologists, chemists, etc. Medical professors as well. It was entirely successful, but in the social sciences and the humanities, it was a disaster. And it was a disaster without the university presidents grasping what they had done, because they imported from Germany the same views that were being taught in Germany to Germans, and the people who taught the Americans were the same mentors to the Nazi professoriate. And they taught to Americans the same exact doctrines. The central doctrine was that nations are like an organism, and the individuals in it are cellular units, or organs within the organism, and they have no rights. Their duty is to sustain the existence of the organism. The particular specifics of their duties were to be determined by an elite, an intellectual elite, meaning themselves. That is, an academic elite, which would have the knowledge to assign duties that would sustain the organism. That was, and they called themselves in Germany, using the German name for this, state socialists. When the Americans came back to the United States after studying in Germany, they couldn't use the term state socialists, which was a term that was an honorific term in Germany, but socialism and socialist were not honorific terms in the United States. They had to invent a description for themselves. And the word they used to describe themselves, they took from a German party political party called the Progress Party, and they called themselves progressives. In that way, they could disguise what they were. They took care not to make political speeches outside of the classroom. A few did, and they were instantly fired. They subsequently, most of them got jobs at other institutions, but some never did. But the key thing is that the first American doctoral programs were monopolized by such people who were identical to the people who trained them in Germany. And therefore, those whom they trained in the United States, the second generation of doctorates, trained by Americans trained in Germany, had the same views. And they had the same views because not only because they were trained or educated in these views, but because the faculty was given, which they did not have before the Civil War, they were given the power of hiring new faculty. And so the existing faculty appointed almost exclusively people who agreed with them. And it's been like that since the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. That's why you've got a one-party university. And not only that, because you have a one-party university, given that all of the universities and colleges that had any sort of standing by 1900 required the doctorate, and therefore everyone was being trained by these 14 or 15 institutions which could give doctorates at that point. There was a unified ideological view that dominated the universities, particularly in the social sciences and so on. And it was the antithesis of the founding view, so that there are no rights, there are only duties. The professors of constitutional law who recognized that the founders had a particular view, and that view was the Lockean view, the view derived from Locke, and that it had to be mirrored in what they put on paper in the Constitution. So everybody knew what the intention of the founders were. Nevertheless, they decided to expand the meaning of the Constitution, widen it so that it could accomplish their goal of having an elite which could govern over the will or over the will of the people. And this has been assimilated into the culture in the media, journalism. It was entrenched in journalism by the 1920s. And became the dominant view, almost the only view from the 20s on. It also became, it started filtering down into the high schools and grade schools and so on, into law, etc. And so what we have is we've got two traditions, the tradition of the natural rights tradition of individual liberty and the autocratic tradition. And we've reached a kind of threshold at this point in which they are clashing. And to be perfectly frank, only one can prevail in the end. And I don't think most people see this. They see that there's conflict, but they don't know what the origin of the conflict is. And they think that somehow it can be reconciled by bipartisanship or being in the middle or something like that, and it can't. There was no compromise in Germany with National Socialism. So I've given you the sort of outline of the book. I also suggest some remedies at the end of the book, which I can discuss if you'd like me to. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask me about what I've said so far, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, and what you just outlined there so concisely, I think extremely important, and I think yours is a unique, uh, how would I say, like a new thesis, looking at this same problem which I've been treating on this podcast, and which is why I urge people to get the book. And I can attest to what you have been speaking of. I've been formerly a university professor. I taught for 7 years international relations, social sciences, history, as you specifically mentioned, where it's the worst. And I taught at the top school in Mexico, and right away, I'm a conservative, right? I have conservative views, Christian, and I noticed that 90+% of the students, which was a mix of Mexican students and international students, were already de facto, whatever you want to call them, left, liberal, globalist, as I like to say. And in the high schools, and that, now thinking back to my undergrad in Illinois, um, my teachers and the school it was basically this one view, as you mentioned, left of center, um, and also, and I like to call this system, as you described, that's autocratic. I use a lot of different terms. It's technocracy, it's scientific dictatorship, it's the managerial or administrative states, it's collectivist, it's liberal, globalist, and I like the fact that you go back so far, which I haven't seen anyone do. I had on the podcast recently J. Michael Waller, ex-CIA. People should read his book, A Big Intel. And, he's former intelligence. And he explained how our intelligence agencies have become woke. And he traced this mind virus back to the 1960s, Germany and the Frankfurt School and the Soviet Union. But you go back, as you described, way back to the 19th century, Germany. And just, I guess, one follow-up question here is why did Germany and Europe become so collectivist, so socialist, communist, so autocratic, totalitarian? Was it Marx? Where did it come from? And is it mostly out of Germany, or are there any other sort of origins of this sort of totalitarian ideology?
Yeah, there are two others. The first would be Rousseau in France. Rousseau was a philosopher who said that, yes, there are individuals, but when they come together and found a government, it becomes an organism which has its own will, which the people may misunderstand, and therefore their vote may not reflect that will. And when it doesn't, some elite person, he called them the legislator, would have the privilege of enforcing what he saw as the will of the organism. That view resulted in the Jacobin period during the French Revolution, and Robespierre, and the bloody reign of Robespierre, terrorist period in the French Revolution. In England, there was Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, and he is a confusing figure unless you sort of peel it down. He rejected the view that there were any natural rights, that any individuals had a right to self-ownership, but he said, we know that pleasure is good and pain is bad. So what society should aim for is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. The problem with that view is, obviously, if you're getting the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, that means that if getting the greatest happiness for the greatest number requires the pain, the excruciating pain of a minority, you can go ahead and do that. So that view also was deeply flawed. And while Bentham said in most cases, the best government would be one that would respect the liberties of the individual, and particularly property rights and freedom of exchange, because that could only be tested by seeing what whether it produced the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, when someone suggested some sort of control or regulation, et cetera, that infringed upon liberty, which they argued was bringing about the greatest happiness, then their argument might prevail if they convinced enough people. So that was a very bad way of attempting to defend liberty, and it failed. And that's why utilitarians, which is what Bentham's philosophy was called, utilitarianism, went from being laissez-faire capitalists to being socialists by the end of the 19th century. So only this view is unique that America adopted. No one's adopted it since. Argentina tried for a number of years from the mid 19th century until the early 20th century, but in the end, they failed to hold power. So this is a unique view, but the view that prevailed in the universities is exactly the same view that brought about National Socialism in Germany. And I might say this, that one of the first people who realized this, there were two people who realized this. One to whom I dedicate my book. His name was Herbert Tuttle. He was the foremost, most eminent historian of Germany in America. He was a professor at Cornell. And in 1883, he wrote an article in the August Atlantic Monthly that year, in which he said that the hiring of these American-trained Germans was contaminating the country by imperiling the ideological foundations of the United States, and that if it continued, it would spill out of the universities into the rest of the culture and make the culture unrecognizable after a period of time. He predicted this exactly. He was on the money. And he was so prestigious, you would have thought someone else would have echoed his views. No one did. His was the greatest warning Americans had. The second warning they got was from a progressive, a man named Walter Lippmann, who was the most famous columnist in the United States. He'd been one of the early progressive journalists in the 1920s. By the 1930s, watching the New Deal, he began to have second thoughts, and he wrote a book called The Good Society, came out in 1937, in which he called the New Deal fascist and the president a fascist. And progressives and those on the left were stunned, shocked. The book was reviewed all over the place, but it opened the Roosevelt presidency to criticisms, but Roosevelt was sufficiently popular that he was elected 4 times. But that was the first warning in the 20th century that anyone got. By the time Buckley's book came out in the 1950s, it was far too late. It was far too late. What were you going to do? Being dominated by one view, and the view being held by a monopoly, if you had the antithetical view, as you had when you went to teach in Mexico, they could not give you tenure. You might not get as good a position, probably wouldn't get as good a position if you had graduated from a very good university and had views which are the antithesis of your own views. And that's the way it's been. So being in ideological step with the majority of your faculty, the overwhelming majority of your faculty, is the only way in which you can have success, be assured of success in the academy. Otherwise, you're walking up a very steep, dangerous cliff, and most people are reluctant to do that. They're aware of this and are very reluctant to do it. So the fact that the position of the founding is such an is upheld today by such a tiny minority of academics means that it's close to impossible to reverse the cultural virus that has infected everything in the United States and is becoming worse with each generation. And frankly, has produced one of its two political parties that tried to get into both political parties, originally got into the first party it got into with great power was the Republican Party in Wisconsin. It had a monopoly on the Republicans in Wisconsin. The place was being governed out of the University of Wisconsin, where the progressives held an overwhelming majority. But finally, it acquired superiority in numbers within the Democratic Party during the New Deal. So that has been its resting place, and the Democratic Party as a result has become steadily more and more autocratic, to the point now that one looks at it and things that it's done over the last 8 years, and it's pretty frightening. It reminds one of Weimar Germany in 1932, to be specific.
Yeah, this is, I made the decision because I have a multicultural background to permanently expatriate from, and I've been calling it since the 2000s, the United Soviet States of America. Although, as you describe, I think fascist is an even better term because I could see this trend of us heading into this authoritarianism. I'm still shocked that 2 years ago, the Department of Homeland Security, which I think itself it shouldn't even exist. It's very reminiscent of Hitler's Stasi, that it singled me out and this podcast and banned me from PayPal, which is fascism, for thought crime, which is so Orwellian. And I'm also banned from Patreon and so forth. And other Americans are getting it even worse. And, I had my courses at university here in Mexico taken away for a couple of semesters. And other guests that I've had on, Swiss academic Daniele Ganser, historian, he was run out. He was very successful. He was run out of the academy, and he's doing even better now independently. He's selling out conferences all over the German-speaking world, actually. I feel like with this podcast, I'm actually reaching more people than I would within the constrained, the confines of the ivory towers. I did want to ask your thoughts on this process that you have described, this conquest of America, the West, and other parts of the world, including here now in Mexico. This ideology, is it a process that's both, concerted and organic? I kind of see it as both, where, some people will veer to one conspiracy extreme and say it's a plot of a secret group. And, I do think there is elements of conspiracy. You detail in your book how some of these figures are pushing this agenda. But I think also there's this organic process, which speaks to the sinful and fallible nature of man and his misguided utopian ideals, where people they're brainwashed into this idea and then they spread it. How do you sort of view this? How do you view this process of this expansion of this authoritarian ideals and idea?
That's an excellent question. Let me answer it in the following way, and I wouldn't probably have answered it this way 20 or 30 years ago, but with a lifetime now of experience at many universities, and then looking at the culture that they've produced and look at how they've affected one party, the Democratic Party, here's what I'd say. Among human beings, just as you have a criminal element who become serial killers, who become serial rapists, and you can't explain why. In other words, it's not a murder of someone they hate, it's just that they like murdering people. And it's not a rape of someone they're attracted to. They just want to rape one person after another. Now, it's difficult for any normal person to grasp that kind of appetite. In politics, it's similar. If you have an autocratic appetite, an appetite for controlling others, regulating the conduct of others by force, not by intimidation, well, intimidation in addition, but force, coercion. That's something I can't explain, but there are always people like this. Now, if the dominant intellectual view through institutions like universities satisfies that appetite, then people who have it will be attracted to it and it will become dominant. That's why the views in Germany, which started with Fichte in 1806 at the university, the newly established University of Berlin, continued. And it continued in this particular group, academics who were social scientists, et cetera. It continued in this group because they had a view of themselves as aristocrats who needed to be obeyed. And they enjoyed that. And those kind of people were attracted to getting these graduate degrees and going to the university. University degrees in Germany in the 19th century accorded those who have them with a certain kind of esteem that one didn't get from attending American universities. They were very prestigious. You became a sort of aristocrat as a result. And so it's no wonder that philosophies like those of Fichte, who believed that society is an organism, and of Hegel, who believed the same things, and then Treitschke and Bluntschli and Wagner and Schmoller, many of these people who were cited by and honored by the Nazis as being the source of their views, that's what happens. In other words, and the founding principles of the United States are the exact opposite, and in fact forbid attempts to coercively control another person. So that's what's happened. There was this accident. I think without that accident happening, I don't know that we would be here today. But it is, and it's ironic, to say the least, that basically it is the same exact views that were held by the Nazis because of the general German ideology from the beginning of the 19th century onward. And so, no, it's not Marxism. Marxism only entered this country in 1933, not in the 1870s or the 1880s. And it entered because the founders of the Frankfurt School in Germany were Jewish and they had to get out of the country. And the president of Columbia was stupid enough to allow them to come there and have a place there at Columbia. But that was late in the game. Although once you start having autocracy spreading, other forms of autocracy can be popular. So you had Herbert Marcuse from the Frankfurt School, who became very popular in the United States. But the origins of the autocratic view is as I've described.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, there's a lot more. Chapter 6, you talk about how once liberals dominate a department in the academy, they can increase their majority by voting to award tenure to like-minded scholars. As liberals dominate a field, conservatives' work comes to be seen as fringe scholarship. And again, as you already mentioned, interesting point how they see themselves as this aristocracy, and that's how we've these liberals today, whether in the academy or just the citizenry who categorize themselves as liberals, they have this view. I've told this story before. When I was still teaching in Mexico, we had our annual international relations conference, and I was with 20 students, with the department director and one of the guest speakers of the conference. And this was, I think, during around 2016, I think right after Trump won, and I couldn't believe what I heard. I've had on this podcast Dr. Robert Epstein, who's a lifelong Democrat, but he's pointed out how Google, Silicon Valley are manipulating the votes to have the Democratic Party win. And he has that traditional Americana view. Well, that's wrong. That's not ethical. Like, I don't want my party to win if it's not, done the correct way. And so this group of university students, department director here in Mexico, they openly said, I wish Hillary would have won. Even if we had to cheat to get her in, we would have preferred that than to have Trump. And I'm the only person there thinking, like, wait a minute, this is not, this is not. I don't care if it's Biden or whoever, if it's done, fair and square. That's who was elected. But so they showed themselves to be this way, a fascist. And just to get, your thought, you also talk about the media, how the press and the mass media generally operate functionally as a propaganda arm of the Democratic Party, muckraking journalists. Basically, they're working for the business oligarchies. They are the security guards of today's business oligarchies. But what about the term progressive? You write that progressives seeking to obscure the Prussian autocratic roots of their ideas came to substitute the term liberal for progressive as a label for their outlook. Could you tell us about that? And then what do we call precisely this autocratic system that we're under? Is it fascist or what?
Well, here's what happened. It was World War I that embarrassed lots of progressives. The most amazing example of this embarrassment, it's actually pretty funny. The first political philosopher at Johns Hopkins who distilled this new view, which was new in the United States, the view held by the Germans, was a man named Wessel Willoughby. And he founded the Johns Hopkins Political Science Department. He wrote 2 books in the 1890s and the other one in the early 1900s. And it sounds exactly like his German mentors. It just sounds like Treitschke, Bluntschli. It's exactly the organism, no individuals, no individual persons, just duties, all the rest of it. He was so humiliated by Germany during World War I, no one wanted to be associated with it after that. And so he wrote a book in defense of natural rights after that, doing an about turn, not out of conviction, but out of embarrassment at how he was exposed as an anti-American fraud. So what happened was they had to some way disguise this relationship between themselves and the German autocrats. And what they decided to do, I think the first use of the term that I've seen in 1916 in the New Republic, they used the term liberal, which meant the exact opposite of what they were using it to mean, instead of progressive. And that it came to be more frequently used, substituted for a number of Americans, including the New York Times, which was entirely different back in those days than it is today, complained about them absconding with the term liberal, which had meant in early 19th century and even late 19th century England, had meant natural rights and laissez-faire in economics. And they began using this term, even though it was as remote as one could be from their actual views. But it had very good, it had, how shall I put it? It was an honorific term in the United States because it was associated with the American founding, and in England because it was associated with the protection of property rights and a free market and laissez-faire. And they grabbed this term for themselves. Well, how were they successful in appropriating this term? Because they could teach anything they wanted in the universities. And so they said that this term meant the antithesis of what it actually had meant when being used in English in England or America, and they got away with it. And then the New Deal came in, and Roosevelt got what he called his brain trust, which meant the first regime, American regime, that had academic advisors, although Wilson himself, of course, was an academic, Woodrow Wilson, and they all called themselves liberals. And that left the people who call themselves conservatives today are actually liberals, and the ones who call themselves liberals today are actually conservatives. And one of the progressive liberals, probably the most famous one in the first half of the 20th century, was John Dewey. And John Dewey pointed this out. He said, if I'd been in England with my views in the first part of the 19th century, I would have been called a conservative. He was a socialist. He said, and anyone who opposed my views would have been called a liberal. He said, now the terms mean exactly the opposite. And real liberals responded to this appropriation of this term, liberal, by starting to call themselves other things. Individualists, they called themselves. Libertarians, they called themselves. And then, unfortunately and ignorantly, they adopted the name conservative because of certain events that occurred in the early 1950s. It was a terrible fumble. And they began to use the term conservative to describe themselves, which is not what the term had meant when it was first introduced into the English language. It meant that you were a feudalist. It meant that you believe individuals have no rights, etc. It meant you were basically an admirer of the Middle Ages. And so that's how the terms came to be used.
Yeah, then I guess then I shouldn't call myself a feudalist conservative. I'm a liberal then. But just got a couple more questions here. And I want to read at length a couple quotes to before I ask this question. You talk about Ruskin and Carlyle, how they idolized the medieval world, especially its feudal hierarchy. You say that in his years at Oxford, Beard borrowed Ruskin's paternalism, appending it to his own racial convictions in a pair of essays recommending a new world order under the auspices of an international bureau. As historian Ellen Noor explained, his proposal: arid plains would be irrigated, swamps would be reclaimed for agriculture, new canals and railroads would be built to bind the nations. The physical labor would be done by Mongol and Negro workers, always under whites. Foreman, later on in the book, you write that if the U.S. succumbs to a one-party autocracy, it will not be by state expropriation of capital or the abolition of private enterprise. It would be the result of extracting so much income from people's earnings that they become utterly dependent upon government provision, as well as by controlling businesses so strictly that their freedom to act depends on rules made up by federal agencies. This is what we're seeing right now. I gave the example of what happened to me with PayPal and the Department of Homeland Security. And so a lot of this, you go on to say progressives in the public and private sectors have not given up their crusade to deprive individuals of their right to self-defense and the protection of their property, strangle the country's energy supply, which we're seeing right now, constrict free speech through government intimidation, including pressure on social media companies to block messages that the current party in power claims are misinformation. I just yesterday on LinkedIn got a post taken down. I shared a clip of one of my past guests who talked negatively of the Biden administration. So that literally happened last night. And so I'm not sure if you've heard of this idea of the Great Reset, right? The World Economic Forum, the Davos crowd. I sort of see it as a neo-feudalism, a neo-techno-feudalism, where the current aristocracy, Davos aristocracy, wishes to do away with the middle class. You also use the term fascistic autocracy. Where are we at currently? What dark future might we be on the precipice of?
Well, I would say the closest event to this upcoming election was the Reichstag elections in July of 1932 in Germany, when the Nazis won 37.4% of the votes. And that was the highest percentage in that year. In fact, Germany voted for another 14% of Germans voted communist. The Communist Party in Germany was controlled by Stalin. So 51% of Germans voted for a dictatorship. And I would say that's about where we are now. And, you know, I hope things don't turn out badly, but you see what's being done and what has been done since 2015 to the Republican candidate. And it wasn't even clear in 2015 why the Democrats would be so opposed to Donald Trump. He wasn't Ronald Reagan. He hadn't articulated a systematic political philosophy, a restatement of founder's position. My own view, my own intuition about it, is they saw in him a kind of warrior who they couldn't intimidate. They believe they can intimidate most Republicans, and in one way or another, and they're not unbending, and they saw him as unbending and therefore threatening. It was that part of his character that frightened them so that they invented a false story about him. And they committed what would have been, had they been prosecuted, crimes. I mean, there's no question about Hillary Clinton, the FISA people, the then Attorney General. I mean, you know, and there's evidence there was collaboration from the Obama administration. It's just, I mean, but once you're on this trajectory, it's that trajectory that you're on, and the average person doesn't know anything about this. They may not have university education. They may not have recognized what was going on. They may just assent to whatever is being broadcast on television by the people who believe these things. But that's where if you ask where I think we are, that's where I think we are. And I think when you look at how uninhibited this last administration has been, and they blame it on Biden, but it's the whole Democratic Party. They're all in accord on this, opening up the border to, to foul up the census the next time it's taken, because that determines the number of seats that are accorded to various states. So that was, and it opens up the border to people who are friendly to those who admitted them in there. They're all wearing Biden T-shirts and things like that. So, you know, they're Democratic votes. That's why the border was opened up. No other reason for the border being opened up. The United States has financed both sides in the Israeli-Hamas war. It first financed the Iranians, and without financing the Iranians by withdrawing the sanctions that have been placed on Iran, if they hadn't done that, then Iran would not have had the billions and billions of dollars needed to finance this war against Israel. So the Biden administration financed the war against Israel. This war wouldn't have occurred had Trump been in office. So there's that. And then there's everything else. He's planning to, if he gets reelected, Biden, planning to increase income taxes precipitously. And that brings me to one last thing that I'd like to say. The income tax, first of all, we had no income taxes up until 1913, only to fight the Civil War. I don't agree with that, but they had no option. They had financed the two previous wars, the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, through debt only by selling government bonds. And once Lincoln realized how extensive, how long, and how expensive this war was going to be, he felt he had no option but to pass an income tax. The income tax went away, disappeared in 1872. They ended it. But then there was an attempt to revive it in 1894. There was a law passed to permit it, and the Supreme Court knocked it down. So they had to add an amendment, the 16th Amendment, in 1913 to permit the taxation of income. Now, remember, the government is supposed to protect all property, not some property, not a particular type of property, but one property. And that's all property that you own. So one would think that if you were going to put a tax on an asset, it would be the whole of your property. It shouldn't be progressive, the tax. It should be non-progressive, but that's what you would tax. Well, if you look at the 19th century, that's what the states did. All the state taxation was a tax on net worth. It wasn't an attempt to plunder anyone. It was an attempt to collect money that accorded with what was being protected, your property. So to tax income and make that the primary source of revenue, there can only be one purpose in doing that, and that is to plunder the middle class. That is what has been achieved with the income tax and the progressive income tax. And it's been achieved all over the world with it. And it impoverishes the lower middle class, makes them utterly dependent upon government. And the middle class, it is making increasingly dependent upon government. The only solution is one I give in the book, and that's a universal sales tax of about 1%. Universal means it's not a retail sales tax. It's on all goods and all purchases of all services and all goods and all assets. And most of the money that it would derive would come from transactions of financial assets, bonds, stocks, derivatives. And a 1% tax without taxing any income, personal income, payroll taxes, business profits, business payroll taxes, no taxes on wealth either, no estate tax, no capital gains tax, etc., no gift tax. And this tax, we worked on it for 2 years, myself and 3 economists. This tax would have been 2019, which was the first year we had data on, the one we looked at, it would have raised $1.1 trillion more than was raised by the present tax system. If proposed, this would be opposed by the Democrats relentlessly. They wouldn't reveal what their opposition was. They would discredit it, attempt to discredit it in all sorts of ways. But what they understand is if this tax replaced the current taxes, they no longer have the middle class under their thumb. It no longer depends upon them. So that's why I suggest this. I have other recommendations, but this is the most important one because it would make the Democrats a minority party.
Yeah, and I think that is a great idea as well. And regarding your assessment, I fully agree with you on where we're at. It's very unfortunate. I often speak of how my grandfather was a prisoner of the Nazis in Croatia for 6 months. He survived. My uncle fought the collapse of communist Yugoslavia in the 90s. We lived there as well for a time. He survived, and now it's almost like every generation we have to push back this evil, this tyranny, this totalitarianism, fascist, whatever you want to call it. The communist, it comes in different forms at different times. Highly recommend your book. You provide new insights that I haven't yet seen, and I read a lot. Could we ever make that tax that you described happen? Any final thought for us?
Well, myself and one of my economists are working on getting this examined by some very important economists. We'll see where that goes. And that's my hope. Because the other things I propose, while they're all important, it's late in the game. In other words, trying to reform higher education is coming about 130 years too late. And so something needs to be done which can attract a majority of people to the right side. And people are principally concerned about their day-to-day experience, their day-to-day economic experience, and their economic struggles. And that's why I believe this is a way of opening things up so that we can do other things like downsize the bureaucracy dramatically, reducing its power dramatically, and other things, reforming education, making certain that anyone appointed to the Supreme Court believes in pre-legal natural rights, right to self-ownership and liberty and property. But in order to get the time to do that and the space to do that, the Democratic Party will oppose all of it. So there's only one party. I'm not saying that I approve of everything about the Republican Party, but it's clear there's one party that's completely out. You couldn't have proposed such reforms to the Nazi Party, and I think the same is true of the opposition here. So those would be my final words. I knew that the conclusion of the book was going to be rather depressing. That's why we explored this option, this on taxation. That's what got me interested in that. And that's why we worked on this alternative. I came up with this alternative, and we worked on it for 2 years before we put the book up for publication.
All right. The book is, again, Winning America's Second Civil War, Progressivism's Authoritarian Threats, where it came from and how to defeat it. The link is in the description from Encounter Books, who I'm a fan of as well. Again, by Jeffrey E. Paul. Thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.